Well, last week, one of the things I don't know if I got a chance to really cover was the Marcionite controversy and that challenge that Marcion brought. And I just want to just touch on that real briefly, that priest Marcion, by questioning the Old Testament and challenging, any Jewishness of Jesus, really forced the church into having to define what our New Testament canon was going to be. And we weren't going to sanitize it from Judaism, all of the Jewish concepts and ideas. It also forced us to have a creed, and that the first one was the Apostles' Creed, to say this is what we believe. To have a sort of and the purpose of creeds, by the way, is quality control. Okay, that is, we have a sense of this is what we believe, and so that we can pass on what we believe is our experience to others. So that's what creeds are for. It's to maintain a sense of order. And the third thing that the Marcion Challenge did for us was it helped us understand that it's the apostles' faith that must be transmitted out. So it gave us this idea of apostolic succession, which in the Catholic Church, Orthodox Church, and the Anglican Communion, we have maintained that idea of apostolic succession as a very important concept. Either one extreme is that it's, the pipeline concept, which is that my hands laid on your hands, my right hand, it's like back and forth all the way. We can trace the hands being laid on each bishop all the way back to the Apostle Peter, okay? Another form of it, or on the other side of the coin, is that the faith, the content of the faith that was given to us by the apostles, is something that we have maintained since from the past all the way to the present. So both of those sort of can be in the middle, and I think that's kind of like where the Anglican Communion is that, well, we can trace back, all the way to bishops, back to the Church of England and Henry VIII and beyond. But we've also can say we have the faith that was transmitted by the apostles. Marcion was challenging essentially that whole concept, and saying, well, I'm only going to take portions of Luke, and I'm only going to take these letters from Paul and not these letters over here. And the church said, wait a minute, there's a whole apostolic content that we are going to embrace, and it is the apostles' faith. That's why our creed, at the end of our Nicene Creed, says, we believe in one holy Catholic and apostolic church. We are the church of the apostles. We are a church that maintains the apostolic tradition. We can't get back to the real Jesus. Like, what did Jesus believe and say? Our faith is what the apostles taught. Okay, and it is filtered through the apostolic experience. So trying to get back to the original Jesus is really impossible, because we can't pierce the veil of the apostolic tradition. It stands as the interpreter, and that's what Susan was just talking about in terms of reading history. We can only read our Christian history. In fact, we can only read any history. Whether you're talking a secular history, let's say presidential historians, when they write, they're writing it from their own perspective and their own lenses. History will have a different opinion later on, 40, 50 years from now. We will judge presidents and their actions, and Congresses, like we were talking right now about George III. We will judge them according to outcomes that happen in history, maybe 40, 50 years later. Christian history will always be written and defined by whoever are what are considered the orthodox people. The heretics don't get to write history, okay? And who's a heretic and who's orthodox is decided, by the winners. What would have happened if Marcion had won the day? Okay, what would our faith be like today? What if today we're going to be looking at our Arius. You know, what if Arius had won the battle about defining Jesus' divinity? You know, we have a different church. So, you know, our faith is really an apostolic faith, bottom line. Okay, then I'm going to go ahead and put share screen on and put my PowerPoint on so that we can move forward. And please stop and interrupt with questions, okay? Please interrupt with questions. I love your questions, and I want to have a little bit of discussion about things. And I'm going to have a couple of questions for discussion that I'm going to bring up as well, okay? Any questions about last week's stuff? Nope. Okay, great, wonderful. And
I do have a small question, or maybe a big question. I wondered, I wasn't clear what the Gnostics, how they were different from, I don't know, what would you call it, mainstream Christianity, or?
Yeah, so Gnosticism was a movement that ran throughout the Mediterranean, and but basically the bottom line is what Gnostics believed was that Jesus had imparted secret knowledge to others, some apostles, maybe some not, and so Jesus had revealed these secrets, and the Gnostics said to be able to be saved, you must understand what these secrets are and be initiated into these levels of knowledge. And Gnosticism has survived into the modern era in various different kind of New Age movements, and it's crept into several different Christian denominations. But that's, again, back to what I was just talking about, the fact that by rejecting Gnosticism, the church was saying, what the apostles gave to us is the only thing you need to have and know for salvation, not some secret knowledge that Jesus supposedly gave somebody else, you know, non-apostles. It is the apostolic faith that is important, not the Gnostic faith. So there is no secret knowledge that you need to know about to be saved. And so that was the Gnostic movement. Many different gospels were written.
They sound to be sort of like the Masons, you know. No offense, but I mean, there's this secret body of knowledge that you have that everybody has to, you know, you have to be initiated.
Right. There's a lot of secret societies going around. Is everybody seeing everybody else like a little strip along the side of their screen?
It depends on what options you choose. But
I don't know how to. Oh, the option. Well, what options are other people using? There.
Yeah.
That's better.
So if you go to gallery view at the top of your screen.
Oh yeah.
Full screen mode. If you go to gallery view, it moves it.
Okay.
So it puts it across the top of your screen.
But when Father turns on his screen share, then whatever you have set's going to get pushed over to the side and you'll just see his screen. Looks like we lost connectivity with him right now.
Right.
Because he had his Milky Way picture up, which is, I think, probably the background of his computer.
I'll tell you that the Gnostics were the QAnon of the early church.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a good
Well, I don't know. That seems a little harsh.
The QAnon is a hoax. I think the Gnostics
It's
were
a hoax, yeah.
a deliberate hoax. I think that the Gnostics were, they really believed in what they believed in. And I didn't, you know, they didn't follow the apostolic tradition, but they did believe in what they believe. Of course, a lot of followers of QAnon follow what they say too. So I guess, but I don't think they were as cultish as QAnon and some of these more recent social media vectored things. Anyway, we'll let Father speak to it.
Are you back?
There we go. Now we have the screen share.
I don't think I'm not hearing it.
Can't hear you, Father, if you're talking.
There we go. Now you can hear me.
Now we can.
All righty. You see the PowerPoint screen now?
Yes.
Hold on. There we go. All righty. So let's take a look at what early Christian church looked like. So it was not a church of rich people. It was not the higher class people in society. It was a church of essentially, there were a few people who were, a few women, in fact, who were wealthy people who supported the church and were, beneficiary, were helping to foster the church's growth and some of their wealth. But by and large, the church was a fairly lower class people, lower in the lower ranks of society. But they offered, caring fellowship. They didn't even want to revolutionize society, or they weren't condemning slavery. They even said that slaves must submit to their masters, but the masters must treat their slaves with patience and equity and philanthropy. They stressed brotherhood and sisterhood, concern and compassion. They looked after widows and virgins and the poor and the sick and the oppressed and those who were in prison. They disapproved the gladiatorial games and shows. And the religion had a great appeal to women, as it does still today. Women were not treated as sexual objects. As I said, they cared for widows and virgins, and some of those women became sort of they were the ancestors of what became future nuns. And so they provided a vocation for women. Women didn't have to necessarily accept that marriage was absolutely what they had to do for the rest of their lives, or marry somebody they didn't want to marry, which was a great out for some people, some women. So what was Christian worship like? Well, Christian worship initially was very much a agape meal, which was a supper, a communal supper, kind of like our coffee hour at Grace, where there's people bring food, and they would go to the synagogue and they would do their, Jewish worship there. They would go to the temple for that. Then the Christians would come over later on to the home, and they would follow, they would do the Eucharistic prayer, the breaking of the bread. They would do the prayers. And then those who were Jewish Christians, like I said, then after the temple was destroyed, after AD 70, the agape meal, the big meal, and the Eucharist became sort of brought together and combined. There was no temple to go to anymore. And so therefore, these two elements came together, much the same way we have it today, except that we do the coffee hour food thing after the Eucharistic worship in the church. They would sometimes do it at the beginning, and then they would stop the meal and then have the breaking of the bread and the wine being shared. And whoever was there as the presider, and if this was happening in a home, and the home may have belonged to a woman, and she was the head of the household, then the woman would lead the prayers. And so this is what the argument has been by those who've been pro-women's ordination, that there were women probably in the early church who were leading and presiding over the prayers said in the home. But the agape and the Eucharistic meals began to separate at that juncture. And it's possibly at that juncture where male dominance of the church happened, where, it was like, okay, now this is happening in a public sphere. Later on, when Constantine comes into power and the Christian church comes into power, that's when we probably get a more male-dominated religion and Christianity. But up until then, it was whoever was the head of the household usually was the leader of the Eucharistic prayer. So it was a very kind of a charismatic kind of worship experience where people who had gifts, initially were given, but later on afterwards, the worship begins to be restrained and it becomes to be more orderly. We have a document called the Didache, and if you'd like, I can send you a copy of it. It's not very long. It'll take you not very long to read, but it gives us an idea of what worship was like in the early church. And it is considered very much, it did not make it into our New Testament canon, although it was recommended for reading, and it was considered a very valuable document by the early church, but it did give us a kind of an idea of what the church looked like. So,
Father, yes, if you
Yeah.
could post the Didache or send it to us, I think it is short and it is very interesting. I've lost my earlier copy of it that I had.
yeah, I will post it here after, as soon as we finish the PowerPoint, and we'll take a look at that. Yeah, but early worship was very, very close to what we are doing today. Even there was a service of the word, so there was a greeting by the bishop, a response by the congregation. Usually, the bishop would say, "The Lord be with you," and the congregation would say, "And with your spirit." Then there was readings of the Old Testament, maybe by a deacon, and chanted in larger congregations. There'd be a psalm or a hymn sung, and there'd be a congregational singing came much later, and didn't really become popular until the 4th century. But there would be somebody who would lead the congregation in singing, like a cantor, and then there'd be a New Testament reading. Any of those books from Acts to Revelation were read, as we do today. There'd be another psalm or hymn sung. The gospel would be read. There'd be a sermon preached by the bishop from a sitting position. The congregation back then stood during the entire service. It wasn't until the 14th century, actually, that pews were put into churches. And that's when people could sit down. But in the Orthodox churches today, in many churches, it is still a standing service. Then those who were not Christians yet were dismissed. And there'd be a dismissal of all those who were not yet baptized. And they would then go on for further instruction. And at Easter is when they would be baptized. And so today in the church, we really don't practice it in the Episcopal Church too much. In the Catholic Church, however, they've introduced years ago, well over 30, almost 40 years ago, the RCIA, the Rite of Christian Initiation for Adults. And I actually wrote the Rite of Christian Initiation for Youth back when I was a Roman Catholic in Los Angeles. I wrote the program based on the RCIA, but for youth ministry. And it is a practice where really you become a Christian in stages. I mean, that is, you move through stages, and then it culminates in Easter, on the Easter Vigil, and that's when you are baptized, receive Eucharist for the first time, that's the ancient model of doing it. And the Catholic Church has moved very aggressively in adopting the RCIA movement. The Episcopal Church, not so much. And the reasons for that, we discussed that in my class last night with my students, is I think that so many of our Episcopalians or Anglicans come to us already baptized from other faiths. We accept their baptism, and so we kind of give them some instruction, in what it means to be an Episcopalian, and then we don't want to keep them waiting for a whole year through any kind of a process, and we want to get them, into our church and get that new blood, working in our church already. And so we're kind of hesitant, but I think we lose something of the power of baptism when we sort of give it away too easily. But back then, you would not give Eucharist to those who were not baptized. And it's become rather fashionable, not fashionable, it's become rather a practice in some churches today to give communion to non-baptized Christians. That is forbidden according to our Book of Common Prayer and the rites and the rituals of it has been looked at by the bishops of the Episcopal Church, and they have soundly rejected that tradition. It's being flirted with and being done in Australia a little bit, but it is, baptism is for those who are baptized. Eucharist is for those who are baptized. If, practice at St. Peter's and other places I've been to is if you're not able to receive communion for whatever reason, you're welcome to come forward and the priest can offer a blessing over you. Otherwise,
Yeah, Father, in the Northeast, it's very common in the Episcopal churches that all are welcome at the table.
Yeah,
So
and-
it's and that's with the blessing of the bishop there.
yeah, and then that's not the blessing of the larger Episcopal church, but that's why bishops get to do what they want to do and nobody goes around and slaps their hands. But it's really not in the rubrics of the Episcopal church, and the bishop is really not supposed to do that because he's violating standards and rubrics of the church. And we had a long discussion about that with our students last night as well. You know, there's there's a beautiful prayer by the Iona community that I'm going to be including in our bulletins when we come back to church, that invites people to come to the altar. And it says, if you've never come to the table before, so it creates an awkwardness for us, and it did at St. Peter's when I was there. We were very conscious of the fact that, you know, that line in that prayer seems to invite people who are not baptized to receive communion. That is contrary to what 2,000 years of church history has been, and it's contrary to the Book of Common Prayer and the Episcopal Church. Church's
I
position.
have a question.
Yeah.
What is the reasoning behind why someone who isn't baptized can't have the Eucharist?
Well, at first it goes back, as I said, practice of the church, of the Christian church from the very beginning.
What's the thinking though? Why?
Because one must be an initiated Christian, initiated through baptism first. And that has been the practice and the theology that one enters into the church, one becomes a Christian by baptism, and then one shares in the communion table for those who are Christians. This has been the practice for forever. And so as to why theologically, you know, we could sort of delve into that, but it's just been our practice, and it is sound theology as well to do it that way. So I couldn't get into beyond that, Jeannie, in terms of why the church has done that, but that's what the church's practice has been. We've always believed that the Eucharist is something that is reserved for Christians. And, you know, sometimes they quote the Jesus saying, you know, that, you know, the woman who begs for scraps, and, you know, he responds with, you know, we're not giving, you know, our bread to the dogs. And so, you know, but those who were not Christians back then were pagans. They believed in other gods. And so you had to question whether this person believed in Jesus Christ, you know, believed in the God of the Christians. And baptism was essentially saying, yeah, I believe that Jesus is Lord. I believe in the Christian God. And that's who I'm, you know, in allegiance with. Other pagan, you know, to admit somebody who was not Christian was to essentially admit a pagan. And why would we admit pagans who don't share our faith at the table? So
the way it was explained to me, now that the Episcopal church that I came up in practiced what we called open communion, which was that if you had been baptized and were admitted to communion in your own church, you were welcome to receive in our church as well. So that was considered open. My few encounters with the Catholic Church were that it was closed communion. You had to be a Catholic, having been through the catechism, your first communion, or you couldn't take. And so if you were sitting there with your family and one of you was Catholic and the rest weren't, they would climb over you, you know, getting past you in the pew to go down and take communion. It was very exclusive. And it was the reason you had to at least be Christian in order to receive communion was because communion wasn't just a snack. It was, and to make it effective, it was your faith that mediated the sacrament. It's the outward and physical signs of inward and spiritual grace, and faith was the mediator of that. So if you didn't believe in communion, if you didn't recognize the symbolic communion with the faith of that meal, then it was meaningless to you, and your participation was just unknowing and profane. And so it did minimal requirement that you at least share the Christian faith made all kinds of sense to me, even if
Yeah.
closed communion did not.
Right. The concept of open communion actually means, open communion means non-Christians, non-baptized Christians. But if you, our rubrics in the Episcopal Church is baptized Christians of whatever denomination are welcome because they're Christians. Open communion really means non-baptized.
So I'm using the wrong term.
Yeah.
Okay.
Actually, I don't know how it was used, but in your church, but open communion really is very narrow in terms of its wording. And
Father,
yeah.
I was baptized and confirmed in the Anglican Church.
Right.
And my husband was Catholic, and when I went with him to his church, the priest wouldn't allow me to receive Holy Communion.
Right.
Because I did not believe in transubstantiation.
Right.
And I mean, I couldn't.
It's more than just transubstantiation. That's not the issue for the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church uses communion as a way of saying you are in fellowship with the Bishop of Rome and the apostolic faith that the Catholic Church holds and teaches. And that's why it's not about whether doesn't based on one doctrine, transubstantiation, because there's Anglicans that believe in transubstantiation. It's not a big deal. It's just simply a way of explaining how Jesus is really present in the Eucharist.
Well, I believe that, but
But
the priest told me that I was a heretic because I
right.
didn't.
Well, because you're an Anglican, and so Catholics are heretics. I'm even more than a heretic. I'm a schismatic. I have this big S on my forehead because I left the Catholic Church as a practicing Catholic theologian. Everything. So I've got a double brand. But the Catholic Churches sees communion differently. So do the Missouri Synod Lutherans, by the way. Missouri Synod Lutherans will not give communion to ELCA Lutherans or to Anglicans, especially not to us. Because
That's sad. That's very sad to me.
Yeah. Well, again, some churches are using it as a fence to keep others out. And so the early church used, the Eucharist in a sense as a fence as well. It says, well, if you're not Christian, then you're pagan and you're worshiping other gods and going to their temple and doing those meals that the pagans do. So it was an either or. Either you're with us or you're against us. And so today, the lines are a little bit blurrier, and, he's a good person. Maybe he has flirted with Christianity, he's thinking about it, but wait a minute, this is a special meal. It means something. And the early church had to find a way of defining what that meant. Yes, Martha.
Two things. Number one, that the reference to the Iona prayer.
Yes.
If at any point we want to go into it, and I don't think now is the best time, but the whole prayer is about come to the table.
Yes.
And we used to have it in our bulletin back in the day, like on the cover of the bulletin, right, which was it was a sign of welcome, wherever you are on the journey of faith, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
And the argument that we had over whether or not that was, an open communion, violation, misleading, blah, 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 was that on the inside of the program, when it came to, we'd have like service of the word on one page and then service of the table on the other page. And at the top, we would say, if you are baptized, you are welcome, to receive communion. Please come forward for a blessing, blah, 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 as you just described earlier. And the argument was that we're putting this prayer at the beginning as come to the table of fellowship, and then we'll tell you how to come to the table of the Eucharist once you're in, right? And so it was toeing the line, the via media between the open communion and the totally closed.
Right.
And the second thing is that some of the arguments for the open communion side of, why would we stand in the way of someone having a spiritual experience of meeting Jesus through the Eucharist just because they haven't been baptized? Like that's a fairly prominent argument in the open communion folks, I think fairly few people talk about their baptism in, at least as we practice baptism in the Episcopal Church, as itself a spiritual experience when they went through it themselves, because so many of us were baptized as infants. And so you don't remember it, you may not know it. God help you if you were like in a hospital and had some emergency baptism, as a, last rites type thing. And so there's always, that's the wrong word. Don't use always or never in church history. But anyway, there's very much a sense where who are we to say that this person doesn't truly believe just because they haven't had time or the education or whatever. Like, do any of us truly understand what it means to be baptized? Do any of us truly understand all of Christianity? Can that really be the barrier we put up to allow people in? All that to say, the rubrics say what they say. The history went the way it went, and the discussion continues centuries later.
And I'm all for discussion. So, I'm just simply saying, here's where we were in the early church. Here's where we are today. We've got a very, very similar style of worship today than we had before. I'm planning on using the Iona prayer in the future. I'm going to delete that line in the prayer that says, if you've never come before, because that creates, I think, the confusion. But I'm going to offer it as a prayer just before we distribute communion, because I want to welcome people to the table of the Lord. But I also recognize that baptism is that sacrament that must be gone through, either as an adult, as a child, or as an infant, that brings you into the fellowship and the grace that comes as a result of that baptism. So I tend to follow what the church teaches, and there are those who don't, and so they're free to do what they want to do. And there are going to be people out there that are going to, violate norms, and they're going to, create their own theologies about why they want to do certain things, and that's okay. That's why some of us are Episcopalians. We're not Roman Catholics. So, all right, let's continue on here. I'll see if I can get the thing to. All right, we're all seeing this. Great. All right. So again, as I said, there was a communion given by the bishop and the deacons, and final prayers, and a benediction, and depart in peace, and as spoken by the deacon, as we do today. So what we're doing today, what was done back then, very, very similar. We are a traditional church, and we have kept the tradition. By the late 2nd century, we begin to see a real distinction in the organization of our church. We begin to have a threefold ministry: bishops, presbyters, and deacons. Later on, presbyters are called priests, after the church is, an imperial church, and modeling ourselves after, pagan priests. We start using the terminology of the pagans to, talk about what the bishop or priest does. But early church councils were very much about bishops and priests coming together to decide what would be done in the church and what would be the but admission to the church was through the rite of baptism. If one sinned, one had to do a public penance, and the Christian community had to be convinced that this Christian was no longer in a state of sin and had performed their repentance. And so they were now, as I mentioned in my sermon, repentance and forgiveness was offered as a process, not as a momentary event. They had to do penance if they lapsed. And then after they did the penance, they were allowed to come back to Eucharist and the common meal. Early churches really were in homes and maybe small buildings that had been set aside. We found one called the Dura Europos Church that had been a home that had then been later converted into a church. Christians met in secret, and there was very much a sense that, you know, when you become baptized as a Christian, that could mean that you were signing your own death sentence, because tomorrow you could be persecuted, you could be put to death. So it was a big deal to become a Christian. I remember at St. Peter's some years ago, we had a young man who was Hindu, and he began exploring Christianity, and he decided the Episcopal Church was where he wanted to join. And so for about a year and a half or two, he came to Mass and church every Sunday, very faithfully. I gave him instruction in becoming a Christian, and when he decided to become baptized, it was a big deal. The Hindu family came and supported him, and it was a very, very big deal for him. And it was at that point, that's when he began, after baptism, is when he began to come to the communion rail, not just to get his blessing any longer, but to actually receive the body and blood of Christ. And so that was as close a practice as we get to today. It was a very powerful event. Early Christians condemned incestuous marriages and exposure of children and infants. They opposed fornication and adultery and abortion. And many writers insisted that marriage was only for procreation, and they also stressed chastity. The Christian calendar didn't get developed until much later. We couldn't decide on when Easter was going to fall, but Wednesdays and Fridays became fasting days, and every Sunday was seen as sort of a Easter Sunday. And we moved the birth of Christ in the West to December 25th as a way of putting into competition one's loyalties as to whether one is going to worship the sun god of the pagans or the son of God, by Christians on December 25th. So we know that December 25th is not the actual birthday of Jesus, but in the West, it's December 25th because we wanted to compete with the Western pagans. In the East, the Eastern churches uses January 6th as the feast of the birth of Christ and the visitation of the Magi. So it is a little different between the East and the West. As I mentioned, the early church had this, organization of bishop, priest, and deacon. Elder was one of the, terms that was used as well. And so the bishops became leaders of the church, and they met in synod in councils with other bishops. And the bishops of the major cities, the major Roman cities like Antioch, Alexandria, and Rome, became particularly important churches, where those bishops eventually were even called papas and popes. The word pope stuck in the West, but it's still in the East. It is still used as a term for the bishops of those big sees. And by the end of the 2nd century, an all-male leadership essentially becomes the rule. Although we do hear of female deaconesses in Pliny's letter to Trajan that we talked about, or we saw last week. Evangelism didn't take place in church services. Evangelism really took place in kitchens and shops and markets. That's what Celsus, complained about, that these are not educated people who go to scholars and hold debates. But there were a few people who did that. Origen and Justin did hold some debates to attract some of the more intellectual people. But really, most of evangelism took place where people lived and worked, and out there in the cities. And but the most effective form of evangelism back then was martyrdom. When people saw the sacrifice that Christians were making for their faith, being martyred and going freely into that with prayer and faith, that was a tremendous draw to the pagan Romans. And by the way, the word pagan was essentially everything else that wasn't Christian. So whatever other religion was practiced, Christians called it pagan. Eventually, they start using that word pagan to mean those people who were rural, uncouth, country bumpkins, people who don't know better. So when Christianity started criticizing other faiths, they called it pagani or pagan. All right, and some of the early Christian art was mainly frescoes, fish and biblical scenes were used a lot, but you know, it was very simple kind of art, fresco, and in the Roman style. Now we have a period of before the church becomes the imperial church. The church is going through some major persecution before its final victory, which we call the final victory, since Constantine, the Emperor Constantine, becoming you know, the sole emperor of the empire and making Christianity a legal religion. We'll get to that. So under the Emperor Diocletian, we have an East and Western empire. We have two emperors with the title Augustus, Diocletian in the East, Maximian in the West, and then there's two junior emperors that hold the title of Caesar. Galerius, who is in the East, is commander of the army and the Danube, and the army of the Danube, which was fighting the Persians at the time. And Constantine Chlorus was in the West. So that organization of East and West worked well for a while Diocletian was the senior Augustus, but eventually, and that made administering a large empire like that in the East and West a little easier, and it created a lot of peace. And having an Augustus and a Caesar, you know, helped with preserving that line of succession, so there would be less chances of civil war. But a great persecution happens under Diocletian, even though his wife and daughter were Christians, they still nonetheless had to be obedient. But the major seems to be the major cause of the persecution was, now that there are so many Christians out there, and the Christians were outnumbering, again, the other pagan faiths, what do we do about Christians who are serving in the military? Can they serve in the military? Are they really traitors? Can they be trusted? To be in the military meant that you honored the emperor, and that meant that you cooperated with emperor worship. And a lot of Christians, were just in the military, were not comfortable with that. And so the question was, if they refuse to serve, if they refuse to honor the emperor, maybe we should just condemn them to death. And so a lot of Christians were seen to be dangerous people because in the eyes of the commanders, they may not obey orders, they may not offer the emperor worship, and so they have divided hearts. And so Galerius convinces Diocletian to start expelling Christians from the military, and he does that by decree. So the persecution is very strong. There's in 303, Galerius and Diocletian begin to destroy Christian places of worship. They force them to surrender and destroy any New Testament scriptures. All acts of Christian worship were put to an end. Civil servants were reduced to Christian civil servants. There were many, were reduced to the status of slaves. And prominent Christians were forced to offer sacrifice. And as I said, Diocletian, even though his wife and daughter were Christians, they had to obey and offer emperor worship. So as a result of that, there was the edicts of toleration, in a sense, that were around were not enforced. And in 313, later on, Galerius, on his deathbed, issues a toleration, an edict of toleration. And eventually Galerius reverses all those past persecution of Christians. And after that, there's this constant back and forth between, after Diocletian's stepping down from office as the emperor, there is a back and forth instability and civil war between his sons. And I'm not going to bore you with all that because it's just sort of a civil war intrigue. But it was essentially, you can take a look at the notes there that I've given you in the PDF. It was essentially very much a back and forth between who's in power and who's out of power. Eventually, the persecution subsides, and eventually in 313, we get an edict from Emperor Galerius that says, you know, Bibles and are not going to be destroyed any further. Clergy are not going to get arrested. We're going to tolerate Christians, and there's a whole new time of religious toleration. But he died the very same year that he issued that toleration. The real turning point for Christianity after all this period of persecution under all these different Roman emperors was the rise of Constantine the Great. And the big event that really solidified that was for Constantine was that he was on his way to a battle to unite, in a sense, the empire. And as he's on his horse and he sees the sun, he looks into the sun and he sees a symbol of a Cairo that appeared in the sky with the words "In hoc signo vinces." In this sign you shall conquer. And he sees that, and then later that evening, in that at bed, he has a dream, and he saw with his own eyes. It says that with his own eyes he saw the trophy of a cross of light in the heavens above the sun, and an inscription "Conquer by this" attached to it. Then in his sleep, the Christ of God appeared to him, and to make a likeness of that sign which he had seen in the heavens, and to use it as a safeguard in all engagements with the enemies. This is what we have from Eusebius, one of the bishops back then. So he has his soldiers put this symbol on their shields, and he is successful in the battle. And afterwards, he credits that success to the Christian God. And he legalizes Christianity with the Edict of Milan in 313. So that battle at the Milvian Bridge really is that moment that convinces Constantine, hey, this Christian God, we got to pay attention to. He had no personal interest in Christianity up until that time. He had nothing to gain by making Christianity legal. He simply respected, I think, the Christian God. And so the question goes back and forth, was he a real Christian or not? I don't think he really embraced Christianity, as we will see, but he respected Christianity. But more importantly, he respected the God of Christianity. And so I believe that he really felt that he needed to, issue this edict as a way of allowing Christians to thrive within the empire. So Christians are no longer being tolerated. Christianity is now a legal religion. This begins to change the church. The relationship between the church and the state are now changed, and we get what is called the imperial church. After the Edict of Milan, Constantine consolidates his power. He defeats other foes. Eventually, civil war breaks out, but Constantine defeats Licinius and unifies the empire. He decides to move his capital from Rome to Constantinople, to modern day Istanbul. And he even draws the lines by which the city is going to be defined. And he invites many Romans from Rome to come to Constantinople and build their palaces and build their homes. The growth is so fast and enormous that they have to start expanding the perimeter of the city very soon after. So he bribes all these Romans to come to Constantinople, and he sees Constantinople as a strategic place for his capital. So, as I said, he never really embraced Christianity in terms of a personal faith that we can see. But back then, now suddenly the Christian church is open, it's legal, its bishops become powerful, and it's good to be a bishop. And you don't want to, hurt your emperor and offend him, because you might actually end up dead. And so the bishops raised no voice of condemnation. They allowed Constantine to be Constantine. He considered himself, after all, a bishop of bishops, with a right to intervene however he felt. And again, like, where do you tell an elephant to sleep, right? Wherever the elephant wants to sleep. You know, you don't tell Constantine how to be a Christian. So he had ecclesiastical advisors and church advisors, but he didn't, embrace it, because he still did some pagan practices, continued to practice even after his, quote, conversion. But his baptism didn't actually happen until his deathbed. Again, being a Christian through baptism was a very decisive step. And once you became a Christian, you weren't supposed to be sinning anymore. Well, is he going to give up all of his sins suddenly and his pagan ways and all of the other things that he wants to do as emperor? Not yet. So he decides to sort of postpone his baptism, because there was no yet rite of penance or rite of reconciliation or rite of confession as we develop in the church later on. Baptism was the turning point from a sinful life to a pure, grace-filled life. And there was no easy means by which you returned to the faith as it was before without the whole public penance thing that we talked about earlier. And so Constantine doesn't want to put himself through the embarrassment of going through baptism and then committing a sin and then not being welcome back within the Christian fold. So he sort of wisely, in a sense, postpones his baptism, because there's no other sacramental avenue by which he can return to the faith as once before. And as I mentioned, there was little to gain for his seeking the favor of Christians, because those people who were in the society's elite were pagans. The Christians were poor people. So again, not a lot for him to gain in terms of personally that, but his cessation of persecution, making Christianity dominant, means that now bishops become identified with the imperial power. And so people began to bribe to become bishops, because bishops had juridical power. And if you had juridical power, you had a lot of power in the empire to decide, legal cases. And so, in a sense, the bishops were the forerunners of our modern day judges. And Christianity now no longer has to be, done in secret. And so now you can do it in churches, and former pagan temples are now being converted to Christian churches. And now bishops get to dress up. They're no longer, bishops, priests, and deacons get to wear fine clothing and silk, and they're no longer wearing rags and meeting in secret. Now it's this marriage of the church and state. And this is where we begin to see the church reacting, or other members of the church reacting and saying, no, the church is sold out, and we are now identified with, with the state. And I want to kind of just take a pause here, because I think this is one of the questions that has I think been part of Christianity for so long. Once this happened and we became the imperial church of Christianity became the official church of the empire. Now everybody wants to be a Christian, and it's the thing to be. So all the elites in society start joining the Christian church. And the question I think for us is, as modern day Christians and Episcopalians, is, what does it mean for us to be so identified with the government and with political power? Even though we have church and state separate in America, in England, in Canada, and in many other parts of the world, Christianity has become sort of the married with state power, and many of our presidents in American church, in American history, were Episcopalians. The National Cathedral in the United States is an Episcopal cathedral. And for many, many years, Episcopalians were thought of as the Republican Party at prayer. You know, we were identified with the elite in government, and you know, we even have in Washington D.C. we have lobbyists for the Episcopal Church, and you know, presiding bishops write letters to presidents and to Congress as if we believed that we still had the old power that we used to have. So I just wonder what your thoughts are about you know, in Christianity today and our role with the government.
You're referring to the Episcopal Policy Network.
Yeah. Right. And I think you might have some familiarity with that, Dale, right?
Well, I guess I'm a member of it. I don't know if it's really like a membership thing, but I subscribe to their newsletter, and
Okay.
I get a lot of mailings from them. Well, you know, I'm a pretty political person in a lot of ways anyway, and you know, I think it's regrettable that you need to have that we need to have a lobbying organization, but it's a counterbalance to the other lobbying organizations that are out there, you know. So, you know, they're doing a lot of things that I think reflect the values of the church. They're trying to reflect those values in Washington and state houses, and I don't see that as a bad thing. I mean, they do a lot of work for. They've spent a lot of time trying to get the Trump administration to stop separating children from their parents, for example. And, you know, to me, that's a good thing. It's kind of sad that we need to tell the government to stop taking children away from their parents for no good reason. But, you know, somebody's got to do it. So, I personally don't have a problem with that.
Dale,
We are not the government, right? We are not the government. We are simply trying to influence the government, and that doesn't seem to me to be a bad thing. We're influencing in ways that
Right.
coincide with our faiths.
Dale, what I missed. What organization are you talking about? You get newsletters from
Well,
that you're explaining?
The national church has something that they call the Episcopal Public Policy Network, or
Okay.
EPN, and it's basically the lobbying arm of the Episcopal Church. And so what Father Frank was saying is, or his question was, is this a good thing, or is this, are we somehow aligning ourselves with the government by trying to influence it in some way or another? I mean, maybe I'm not saying it.
Well, and the reality is Christianity after this, until America is on the scene, United States on the scene, Christianity and the state powers were in a sense joined together.
Right.
And of course, there's that whole battle between church and state, that the papacy battles with kings and emperors and
Right.
in Europe, but it was Christendom. The Constantinian religion, Christendom, is no longer, today. It no longer exists, But for a long time,
Right.
Christianity and the state were one. And this is where it begins to happen. And those who were rigorists, true Christians, and this is what we get today. We always get in every church and people today who say, well, you're not a real Christian.
Right.
You're an Episcopalian,
Yeah, I've heard that.
or, it happens in the Catholic Church, happens in the Lutheran Church. It happens in it happens in Judaism. It happens in every religion in
Right.
the world.
Right.
Where people point the finger and say, well, you're not really fill in the blank.
Right.
And the reality was that when the church became the Constantinian church, an imperial church, people started saying that's the collapse of the church. The church is over. We're
Right.
done.
Yeah.
And so we get the reaction being the reaction of the monks in the desert who go off to the desert, with the leadership of people like Anthony of the Desert, St. Pachomius, wanting to say, I want to leave society. I want to leave that whole imperial Constantinian faith, and I want to just go off and be my own Christian as I see best. And
a monastic approach to
the monastic
monastic orders.
the monastic movement was simply a reaction to the imperial church, saying, we know better and we're going to do. It was like the Essenes.
Right.
Because the Essenes said, hey, Jerusalem, you're corrupt. Hey, Jerusalem, you're in league with the Romans. We're going to go off to the desert and do our own thing, and do it the right way. And so the monks were essentially the radicals who were saying, you know, we know how to be a Christian, and it ain't the way it is by being a bishop. And the worst thing you could have done back then, according to these people, was to become a bishop, because that was to be identified with Rome.
Something I saw I read in the reading, I don't remember exactly the full context of this, but one of the things that I think it had to do with he was talking about Christianity as a unique in the sense that you were attempting a personal relationship with God. And I think that,
Bill, you're breaking up. We can't hear you. It's attempting a what?
having a personal relationship with God, not necessarily a corporate relationship with God, and that Christianity was sort of unique in that sense. But if you're going to have a personal relationship with God, then you probably aren't going to, you're probably not going to find any one single person who, has the same view that you do. So it's not surprising that people that we have a million different denominations.
Right.
We don't agree.
Martha.
I just wanted to say about the Christendom alliance with power, that one of the things that seems to be happening now in 21st century Christianity is a grief over the loss of that empire and influence. And there's particularly with the rise of fundamentalism and the sort of power aligned with the evangelical church, that is also shared by other denominations, the Catholics and Mormons and so on, that there's this, that the only way to rally the troops is to declare war, right? And so you get this, there's a war on Christmas. They're trying to take the Christ out of Christmas, and they're depriving us of our influence and power, and that's not okay. We've got to conquer in Jesus' name, and all this sort of phenomenon. And there's what is viewed as the demise of the mainline congregations, because we are waning in our influence over the culture, because we are not the great power. And then there's the experience that I have of being in a church like Grace, where we're not changing San Marcos in some vast cultural, we have 3 services and 16 campuses and we're not the Rock Church, right?
Right.
And that's comfortable for me, because what I perceive is that there is a spiritual power that we have that has very little to do with economic success, that has very little to do with political power or getting our way, however you define it. And so I find myself on the monastic side of things as a result. I will gladly take off this privilege and this power and set it aside and say, I think I'd just as soon follow Jesus. Thank you ever so very.
Right.
And, the dude who doesn't even bother being baptized and taking on the potential for martyrdom, or even any kind of need to repent or reconcile with anybody else, waits until his deathbed to grab the celestial fire insurance. I go,
Right.
And so I get that he's just as marked by the sign of the cross as the rest of us. And so we're going to get to heaven and have a big fat talk.
And that's the thing. Now that the Christianity is identified with the empire, what's the goal of being a Christian? Getting to heaven. It's not about the resurrection or the sufferings of Christ that when the church was being persecuted, martyrdom, suffering, resurrection, easy message, attractive message. But now it's about, well, let's see, if it's not suffering, because we're not suffering, because now we're the imperial church, and we're the favored children, then what's it about? Well, it's about getting to heaven. And so that's been our theology since back in the days of Constantine for the church. Pie in the sky when you die. Okay? We have forgotten that it was about a new world. That's why, at the very end of our creed, we say, and there's a new world to come, and we think heaven's the final destination. N.T. Wright, Anglican bishop, says, hey, heaven is not the final destination. It's a waiting room for what's going to happen here on earth. A new body, a new kingdom, a new world run by God. So that was the eschatological, apocalyptic hope that got lost during the Constantinian Christendom church. And now we're trying to recapture, well, what does it really mean to be a Christian? And that's what I think. I'm very hopeful that our diocese and the bishop, with advent of somebody like Christian Gillette, and who's refocusing us around evangelism, and I want to focus this on, what is our mission as Grace Church? What's our unique mission? We're not going to be Rock Church. We're not going to be any other church. We're going to be Grace. What does it mean to be Grace Church? So, anyways, to sum up, the monastic movement was a reaction. Let's go away. Then the next major question, which is in your outline there, is the Donatists, the Donatist controversy. What's all that about? Basically, it's what do we do with Christians who have lapsed in the faith by doing pagan worship and becoming, and sinning or doing other things? What do we do about these people? How do we welcome them back? And there were those Donatists who said, never welcome them back. Once you've betrayed Christianity, you're done. And then there's others who said, hey, maybe we just have an appropriate probationary period, wait for them to offer the proper penance, and then we can welcome those Christians back. We don't have to sort of rebaptize them, but we can welcome them back. That's what the whole Donatist controversy was about. And if this person who lapsed or was a sinner was a priest or a bishop, are the sacraments that they offer valid? And what St. Augustine and others in the church said back then was, wait a minute, if I go out Saturday night and now I go out and get drunk and, commit adultery and I'm a terrible sinner, and then Sunday morning I wake up and offer Eucharist to you, is that Eucharist valid? And the Donatists said no, because that priest has made himself unworthy. And St. Augustine and the church said, his unworthiness has nothing to do with the validity of the sacrament. That is a sacrament that is still valid. Once a bishop's hands have been laid, even if that bishop turns out to be a horrible bishop, all of his confirmations, all of his actions as a bishop are all valid. We had at Trinity Cathedral, when I was a brand new priest, I learned about a priest who had been, I guess, either employed or with the diocese or there at Trinity Cathedral, who faked ordination papers and faked his diplomas and transcripts and was functioning as a priest at the cathedral, celebrating Mass daily. The question is, were his sacramental celebrations and actions valid or not? He wasn't a duly ordained priest. So that was a question I threw out. Somebody said, well, yes, I think he was. Those masses were valid. Well, I'd like you to write a theological position paper supporting that, as to why that person's, actions and Eucharist were valid, because he never was ordained. So I don't know if that would bring up that challenge for you, but that's what the Donatist controversy was about. The Arian controversy, which is outlined again in your PDF as well. The Arian controversy was, the question is, was there ever a time when Jesus was not? In other words, was he made by God? Was there a moment when God created him in the same way that we are created? And Arius believed, theologically, he put his position out there, that there was a time when Jesus was not. There was a time when he came into existence. And it may have been the first thing that God did before he even made the world, but he made him. And on the other side is Alexander and later Athanasius, who come back and say, no. And so Constantine, who wanted his religion, his new faith, Christianity, to be a source of unity for the empire, thinks that this could be a source of major controversy. And so he invites 1,800 bishops or more to come, and about maybe 300 to 400, we don't know, 318 is the number, legendary, that comes to Nicaea to decide the question. And he says to them, don't leave here without deciding this question. I want to know, what do we believe about Jesus Christ? Is he God? Was he, God from the beginning? And so we came up with the church, these bishops came up with what's called the Nicene Creed, which we recited today in our liturgy. And most of it, the big chunk of it, is all about Jesus and about his status. So I'm going to bring up the slides again for a minute and move us there so that we can see this Creed of Nicaea again and how it ends. The creed ends with a condemnation of Arius and his followers who believe, and those who say there once was when he was not, and before he was begotten he was not, and that he came to be from things that were not, or form another hypostasis or substance, affirming that the Son of God is subject to change or alteration. These, the Catholic and Apostolic Church anathemizes. So you're out, you're excommunicated if you believe any of those ideas. But that is essentially the creed that has been recited by Christians forever. So the word homoousios that they use is a word that essentially means of the same substance, not like, but of the same, co-eternal. Jesus is begotten, not made, of one being with the Father. And this is why Mormons cannot affirm the Nicene Creed, nor can Jehovah's Witnesses, because, and a host of other, groups out there, because they cannot affirm the creed. Whether you're Baptist, Lutheran, even if you don't use a creed within your liturgical life or church life, the creed is the basis of Christianity. It is the frame by which Christianity is defined. If you can't affirm that's in the creed, you're not a Christian. Mormons can't affirm that, so they're outside. Now, Mormons don't want to hear that, by the way, but the best you can say is Christian heritage. They've got good roots, but otherwise, they're not able to affirm that faith. So whether you're in the Rock Church, you're High Church, Lutheran, Orthodox, Catholic, and all in between, Christians, that is the deciding thing. Well, can you affirm the Nicene Creed? Yes, no? Okay, that's what makes a Christian a Christian. Any questions here on that? What you got? Dale, you're laughing.
No, I'm just saying, you don't think about this stuff very often, which is what's making this kind of interesting for me.
Good, I'm glad that it's...
I mean, the key phrase in all of this is of one being with the Father. That was the whole thing, right? And so when you read the creed, that doesn't necessarily stand out for you. But that's what the whole thing was really about. That's what they really wanted to say.
Right.
That's the thing that got everybody all excited was. So,
yeah, in other words, if we had adopted Arianism, we'd be worshiping a creature of God.
Right.
You know, just like you and me, we'd be worshiping a person who was created. But what we're saying is that Jesus was God. And there was not a time when he was not. That he was and is from the beginning with God and is God. There was a moment, the begottenness was the moment that God decided to, make, or create this moment of existence in another plane. But that same God was also the God that was the creator God, the God the Father. Now the Eastern Church was a little nervous about this because it said, well, then did God suffer on the cross, or did just Jesus suffer on the cross? And the church made a distinction and said, no, Jesus as the Logos and his duality of humanity and divinity was the one that did suffer on the cross, and that God the Father did not suffer on the cross. So, and that's in my notes there that I've given to you.
How does the church explain about if why Jesus said there are certain things even I don't know? He
Yeah.
would know, wouldn't he?
Right. Now, there are passages that show Jesus in his ignorance and his humanity. And then there are passages that we have where it seems to show, hey, Jesus seems to know everything, definitely divine. And so those two passages are there. And my position, and the position of many theologians, is that we need to uphold both Jesus' humanity and his divinity. They're both there. Jesus is clearly, in some places, doesn't know, because that's his humanity. If Jesus, in other words, if Jesus had from birth thought, I'm not human, I'm God, that would have been a complete blasphemy for him. That would have been, I'm nuts, I'm crazy, I can't be God and be a good Jew. So he, I believe, had a slow revelation of who he was and his identity. I think he went to Jerusalem in his humanity, not knowing how this was going to turn out. I think he went to the cross completely in his humanity, not knowing how this was going to turn out, hopeful that somehow God would make this happen. God would make good on his death. That death would not be the final word. But he wasn't on the cross going, oh, I'm hanging on the cross here, but no worries, guys, I'm going to be up in 3 days, no biggie. No, he was suffering on the cross in his humanity. His divinity was, I think, veiled, something that he wasn't able to fully see. He saw a unique, intimate relationship with God the Father, but not a full, I'm God, from the very beginning. It was a humanity. And also we need to take into account the fact that the Gospels were written, many, many years later. And the tradition that we have are that in some cases, some gospel writers want to, already knowing, it's already happened. The resurrection has happened. There's been a lot of discussion about Jesus's identity already happening for 40 years or more. And now we're coming to a different understanding of who we are. It's like you writing a story, Jeannie, about something that happened at the time, and with reflection and with time, you now see the reason why somebody said what they said or did what they did, because you now have the power of the memory and insight that you didn't have before. And so there is a certain amount of retrospective theology that is happening, where people are reflecting, Jesus obviously knew that because we know that he was God, or Jesus said this and he said it in his humanity, and we need to uphold it because it is what he said. And so it's a short explanation. There's a great book that I love called The Conspiracy of God, And I'm going to give someday I'm going to give a class on this where he talks about the slow revelation of his identity to Jesus. Jesus' identity was slowly revealed to him. And the Holy Spirit was his teacher, was guiding Jesus in terms of not only his mission, but his destiny. And that this was a slow progression, not an immediate revelation. Because if it had been an immediate revelation, I think we'd have a very different kind of gospel story and perhaps a very different type of ending. But the Gnostic Gospels, the reason the Gnostic Gospels became so popular was because the later church in the 3rd and 4th century said, hey, Jesus was God, we've all defined that, so let's rewrite the Gospels with Jesus being God. So for example, in one of the Gospels, the Gnostic Gospels, it's got Jesus wants to climb this tree. And so he makes the tree bend down so that he can just simply slide onto the branch, and then the tree goes up. And then, it goes down. So these miraculous kinds of stories about Jesus and his divinity gets rewritten in these Gnostic Gospels, where he knows these truths and he knows who he is, and they don't really reflect what the early church was dealing with and struggling with. So that's a long way to answer your question, Jeannie. I hope I did a little bit of help with that.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. There's also in the chapter 2 of letter to the Philippians, chapter 2, verses 6 through 11. Take a look at that. It's called the Philippian hymn. I wrote a paper in graduate school about that hymn. It's called the kenosis theory of Christ, which is that Christ emptied himself of his knowledge of his divinity so that he could take the form of a slave. And so that he could be amongst us and a human, he retained his divinity, but he emptied his knowledge of his divinity. Okay?
That makes sense. That makes sense.
Yeah. So take a look at that passage, and where it talks about, and this is where the church believed. Yes, he's God, but he doesn't know he's God.
Was that, did you say that was Luke?
Philippians chapter 2.
Oh, Philippians.
Yeah, chapter 2, verses 6 through 11. And it is the basis for what's called the kenosis Christology that is in the church. And I'm a big fan of kenosis Christology. All right, I'm going to end here. If there's no other questions, you've all got the handout. I didn't cover everything page by page in the PDF, but that's why you can take a look at it, read it, and we'll take a look at maybe a little bit more of it next week. Next week, we're going to talk about the Council of Chalcedon. So it's going to be a much shorter, compressed class, but we'll take a look at, any questions you may have about the Arian controversy. Every time there's a council of the church, by the way, it raises new questions that the church has left. In other words, we create a kind of a void, and now another council needs to be called to answer the questions that the prior council raises. So the Arian controversy and the Council of Nicaea is not the only council. We need to have another one, because we're still not clear about, well, what is the relationship between God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit, the Trinity. So Chalcedon really helps us get to that next stage of defining what that relationship is going to be.
Are we going to continue to post these things on YouTube?
Yeah, absolutely. That's what
I wasn't able to be here last week, but I was able to follow.
Okay.
View the thing on YouTube.
Cindy
I'm probably
said
not going to be here next week either, so
okay.
I don't want to fall behind.
Well, they will be posted, and Cindy said she was going to be posting, and this is being recorded. So
Fabulous.
Great. And please shoot me an email with any questions that you may have, and suggestions on how to do this better in this world of Zoom. And I like being able to see you all in person, but this is what we got to do.
This is working fairly well, I think.
Okay, great. I love being able to, this is how I'm teaching School for Ministry. It's how I'm teaching my world religions classes as well. And so it seems to be.
Thank you, Father.
You're welcome, Edna.
Thank you.
Have a good week, everyone.
Thank you. Have a great week. Take care.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
This is Penny, and I wanted to recommend a movie that's on HBO called A Hidden Life. And it's about an Austrian farmer who is during World War II, and he has to make a pledge to Hitler to join the Nazi army. And he's Catholic, and he believes he cannot pledge his allegiance to Hitler. It's a long movie and it's rather slow, but it certainly helps me at least struggle with what kind of ethical, religious commitment would I make if I was asked to do this? Because of course the implications for him and his family and 3 daughters are just enormous. And I'm not going to tell you what happens, but it's called A Hidden Life, and it's on HBO. As I said, it's long, and it takes you through his spiritual struggle with being required to pledge his total allegiance to Hitler. And I was reminded of it as we were talking about the persecution time. And it certainly was modern also. Thanks.
Thanks, Penny.
Thanks, that was great.